All right. Well, it's Thanksgiving 2021, and we're doing this little interview about Matt wanted to know why I got back into buying a motorcycle after many years. And let's start with the very beginning. It's funny, my sister Nanette, who lives out in California, she was the first one in the family that wanted to buy a motorcycle probably back mid 60s. I guess she was the real rebel. But mom wouldn't have any part of that. That never happened. So later on, my brother Tom, I believe, was the first one to get a motorcycle, Yamaha 175 dirt bike. And then my brother Jim followed suit probably a year later and bought a little Honda CL 200. And then probably when I was 17, I bought a dirt bike as well. So getting my motorcycle license, Jim had to, I think I had to ride with somebody on the motorcycle. I can't remember how MVA did it at that point in time. I think I just had to have another licensed driver with me. Maybe he was on his motorcycle. And I failed the written part I did, but the driving part I failed because maybe I took a turn too wide or something like that. So back then you could probably take it a week or two after your initial test. So I went back the second time, and I did better. But it was funny because I remember the instructor who was watching me. Some other guys pulled up on a motorcycle, and I kept on glancing. He wasn't even watching me. He was talking to the guys on the motorcycles. So it's like I pulled up and looked, all done, and he goes, "Oh, okay." He just signed off on it. I didn't think he watched me 80% of the time, which I guess was a good thing. So, and I used to ride the motorcycle to work. I used to work in Towson, work in Towson, so it was my wheels to get to and from work. And I probably rode it until late fall. And then when I worked down in Columbia, I used to ride it down to Columbia every day for work. My brother Tom was living down in Laurel, and there was an area down there called the Gravel Pits. And it was a large area that I guess had been open for some type of mining or whatever, and the owner used to let people come onto the property and ride Jeeps, four-wheelers, whatever they had on the property. And we used to go down there and just have a lot of fun. And then later on, I had that bike for several years, and then I decided to move up to a Honda four-cylinder, more of a road bike rather than a dirt bike. And I bought that down in Essex, I think it was. Can't remember the name of the dealership. And then I had that bike for a couple of years. The longest trip I ever took on that was up towards probably Pittsburgh. One weekend I just got to be in my bonnet that I was going to take a trip, and I was a little bit ill prepared because it got quite cold during the day, and didn't really have any place to spend the night. I think I spent it sitting in a little waiting room of a gas station. I probably call it a couple hours sleep, and then went back, turned around the next morning and came on home. So that was the longest trip I ever took on that bike. I did do Ocean City one time as well. And then, again, I don't know why I wanted to upgrade again, but I bought a Yamaha 750, a bigger bike with a drive shaft. And I had that bike, and that was the bike I had when Pam and I first met. And Pam and I, and then Uncle Jim and his wife Barb, we took a trip out to Harper's Ferry, I think one time, Pam rode with me a little bit, not a whole lot. And then, matter of fact, going back in time a little bit, just before I was married, I decided I was going to take a trip. And I think my mom talked to Jim and said, just go with him and keep an eye on him. So we planned a trip. We went up to Canada. And on the way up, I remember going through Boston, or New York and Boston. And then we took a trip up to the top of Mount Washington. And then we came down, and I think we were camping at the time. So then we left there, and we drove into Canada. And the funny thing about that story was we stopped in one town to get something to eat, and nobody spoke English. And then a little while later, we were on the road, and we get into the next town, and it would be like a Towson or something like that. And we walked up to some young guy and said, "Excuse me, do you speak English?" And he looked at us like, "Of course I speak English. Why wouldn't I?" And he said, and we said, "Well, the town 2 hours, oh, don't worry about them. They're just different, you know." But it's just so funny where one town, they refused to speak English, and the other town looked at us as if we were crazy asking if they did speak English. So we drove the turnpike up there, cruising pretty high rate of speed because the speed limit up there was 70, and we were people passing us like we were turtles. So we had to speed it up a little bit to keep up with traffic. And I remember Uncle Jim. I guess I was anxious to get home. Uncle Jim would say, "You'd be pulling for gas," and it's like he was on the road instantly again. It was like it was a nonstop ride from Canada all the way back home. So that's been the longest trip I ever took. I don't know how many miles it was. Maybe 1,000 miles total. We put in a lot of miles every day. We didn't do any really sightseeing other than Mount Washington. And we drove on, I believe it's called the Queens Highway. It was a long stretch. I'm imagining east to west that we were on, just putting a lot of miles on the road. But I do remember it was probably, in the very beginning of the trip when we were going through maybe the GW Bridge up in New York or some toll bridge. I remember somebody throwing a bottle out their car or truck at me. And it might not have been at me, but they were just throwing a bottle out, but it just smashed right in front of my motorcycle. And we got caught in rain a couple of times. And of course, you buy these little rain suits from, like at that time, Sunday Surplus. And they lasted all of about 5 minutes because the wind was just beating them and tearing it to shreds. And they were literally just worthless little plastic jackets that you had on. But we didn't have any close encounters other than when we were on this Queens Highway. We saw how fast the motorcycles would do. But other than that, we obeyed all the speed limits and drove cautiously. Jim and I believe it was probably off of 95 in Boston. We couldn't find a campground, so we pulled into one of these big rest stop areas that you would find, and we looked around, and it's getting late in the evening. We were tired, so we had our sleeping bags with us, so we parked the bikes, and there were some big dumpsters and a fence, so we just went behind the dumpsters and the fence, rolled out the sleeping bags, and caught some sleep that night. Nobody bothered us, but it wasn't the nicest campground we ever stayed in, but it suited us, and it worked out for that night. One time when Uncle Jim moved up to Norrisville and I was still living in Towson, I came up to visit him. And again, this is pre-cell phone days. And I was coming up towards Norrisville. Actually, I was pretty darn close to where we live now because I remember pushing the motorcycle past the neighborhood. But it was a hot, either July or August day, and I got a flat tire. And so I had to pushed the bike probably about 3 miles until I got up to Uncle Jim's house. And so as soon as we got up there, of course, my mom was livid because she was expecting me to be home, and it was getting later and later, and I never called. So once we got to Uncle Jim's house, we had to call Towson 825-2411 to call my mom, just let her know everything was okay, and I had to get the tire fixed. And then after Pam and I had been married and our first child was on the way, I looked out in the driveway and just saw it was just time to get rid of it, from a risk standpoint and better use of assets as far as money goes. And I think I traded that bike in with Pam to buy her first little Mustang she had, and hadn't thought of motorcycles at all since that point in time. It was just like been there, done that, done. And so fast forward about 30 some odd years, Pam and I were visiting Matt up in Jersey City one night, and we were walking along the promenade there, and was just walking, having a conversation, and I literally stopped in my tracks, seeing this motorcycle that was parked there, and it was, I guess you could say, it was love at first sight. I looked at this motorcycle, I was like, it took my breath away. It wasn't a Harley, it wasn't a Honda, a Yamaha. I'd never really seen it before, but it was a Moto Guzzi. And being Italian, it was a little more exotic than any of the Japanese or American brands. But it was the design of the bike. They really put a lot of detail into the design of the bike. It's very, to me, it's a piece of art. And so that was probably about 5-6 years ago, and I hadn't thought about it. Then I started checking on the internet, and come to find out, where Tom, Jim, and I go scuba diving up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, come to find out there's a Moto Guzzi dealership 15 minutes away from there. And so we went in there after our dives and walked into the showroom, and they had this motorcycle sitting there in the showroom. And my first thought was, well, if my feet don't touch the ground, for people that don't ride motorcycles, you have to be comfortable on the motorcycle. And on my Yamaha, it sat a little taller than this motorcycle. So whenever I came up to a traffic light, I always had to tiptoe it on my tiptoes and then decide which way I was going to lean it in order to stay upright. So that was the first hurdle I had to jump. It's like if I sat on it and my feet don't touch the ground, that's end of story right there. I'm not going down that road again, pardon the pun. So I got on it, and both feet almost lay flat on the ground. I was like, oh boy, here we go. And then the other thing too, it has a drive shaft versus a chain, so it's much quiet. Well, not really quieter, but it's just low maintenance and a little smoother. To me, it is. And something about black. This model it's all blacked out, black pipes, black everything, and it just talked to me when I saw it. So that's what made me get this motorcycle at this point in my life. It's just, to me, it's more the aesthetics. It's not so much about wanting to get back on a motorcycle. It's the aesthetics of a machine that, to me, just speaks to me more on a level from an art standpoint or a beauty standpoint, rather than, oh, you want to go out riding a motorcycle. That's almost secondary. It's just such a beautiful machine that it really caught my attention and captured me. So when I arrived at the dealership, he pulled it out on the floor and started it up, and I heard it run, and so we packed it up. And then the next morning, I went back and talked to him more about it. So probably, I think it was about 3 weeks later, Pam and I were planning a trip to New York City, and I told her I really wanted her to take a look at this motorcycle. And it was pretty much along the way up to New York. So we got up there and had to wait a little bit. It's a large dealership up near Lancaster. And so he brought it back out on the floor again, and I sat on it and looked at it and paced back and forth. And then he asked the dreaded question, do you want to take it for a test drive? And this is the part that scared me, because how would I react on a motorcycle after nearly 37 years, I guess. So they pulled it out into the lot, and he gave me a couple of pointers, starting it and such. And so I just started off slowly, and there's a large parking lot, and I just drove around the lot, shifting gears a little bit, kind of getting the feel for it. And it didn't feel awkward or anything. It's, to a certain extent, I feel like I picked up right where I left off as far as riding a motorcycle. Was I nervous? Yeah. Here's a motorcycle I don't own yet, and I didn't want to do anything foolish. So they put it back away, and that's when we decided to get it. And so brother Tom, he drove me up there. And so we got through all the paperwork stuff, and I had a GoPro, and I'll check to see if I had the footage. But I remember pulling out on the street for the first time, and 37 years on a motorcycle. And it was funny because when I first hit maybe 30 miles an hour, I felt like I was going really fast. And so then, hour later of driving, 30 didn't feel so fast. 40 felt comfortable, and 50 felt comfortable. 60 felt a little fast because the wind was, hitting on me pretty hard. But it took a couple hours for me to get really acclimated. I had to learn this particular bike, but also just more of a comfort level of riding a motorcycle again. And I guess to a certain extent, you never want to get comfortable riding a motorcycle because you have to be all eyes all the time. You can't relax your eyes not looking at surroundings, because things, a pothole might be an inconvenience to hit in a car, but on a motorcycle it could be fatal. Or if somebody pulls out in front of you and if you have to stop really sudden, again, in a car it's inconvenience, maybe a fender bender. On a motorcycle it's a whole different story. So my goal is to never have to get to that point, so I'm going to be very careful and always keep a sharp eye out. Accidents happen, and but as they say, you only go around once. One of the things that I feel when I'm out riding, even though it's been, this motorcycle only has a couple hundred miles on it, still breaking in, I kind of liken it to, not kind of, but very much like when, for about 12 years, we had a boat, a Bayliner. And there's something about being in control of an engine that you can hear that for certain people, and I guess I'm one of them, it's like you and the machine. It's like there's a tight relationship between the two of them. And I used to feel that way on the boat when you get it up on plane and you give it gas and you hear the engine roar to life. Same situation with the motorcycle. You'll be going along and you'll notice a long straight open road, and you pull back on that throttle and you hear the response of the engine. There's a certain thrill that you get from that.